The house felt so quiet after he left, but his presence seemed to linger everywhere. She sat on the sofa, staring at the faint impression he'd left on the cushion. Her mind was restless. She didn't understand why. It was just a casual interaction, nothing more. But the warmth in his words and the way he looked at her stirred something deep inside, something she thought was long gone. That night, she replayed their conversation in her head, his smile, his laugh, the way his eyes noticed things no one else did. It wasn't just his charm, it was how he made her feel seen and important. It was such a contrast to the cold indifference she had grown used to. Her husband came home late again, as usual. He barely acknowledged her before going straight to his office. The sound of his footsteps felt heavier than ever, each step reminding her of the growing distance between them. The next morning, she picked up the phone and called the plumber again. She told herself it was practical. There was a strange noise from the pipes overnight, maybe something missed during the last repair. But as she left the message, her hands shook and her heart raced with anticipation. He arrived that afternoon, just as warm and friendly as before. But this time, there was something different about him. His smile lingered a little longer, his gaze a little more deliberate. "Didn't think I'd be back so soon," he said, setting down his tools. "There was a noise," she said nervously. "I thought it might be the pipes." "Let me take a look," he replied. Rolling up his sleeves. As he worked, she found herself unable to look away, drawn to him by the pull of their earlier connection. She brought him a glass of water, and when their hands brushed, the spark was undeniable. This time, neither of them looked away. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice low and steady, his eyes locked on hers. The moment between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat, as he stepped closer. "You don't have to thank me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He paused, as if caught in a silent debate. Then, as though crossing an invisible line, he reached out, his fingers lightly grazing her hand. "You've been on my mind," he admitted, his voice calm yet filled with an emotion she couldn't ignore. Her breath hitched at his words, the weight of them crashing over her. She knew she should step back, end this before it went too far. But she couldn't. Every part of her yearned to stay, to feel something real for once, no matter how wrong it was. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was both hesitant and hungry, filled with years of longing neither could suppress. In that moment, the world seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, reality hit her like a tidal wave. "I shouldn't have," she began, her voice trembling. "Neither should I," he replied, his expression conflicted. "But it felt right, didn't it?" She searched his eyes, looking for an answer she couldn't find within herself. She sat there, her hands trembling slightly, as her voice broke the heavy silence in the room. "I don't know what's right anymore," she admitted, her tone laced with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to feel. They sat together on the sofa, a small but palpable space between them. The air was charged with unspoken emotions, each of them teetering on the edge of a truth they weren't ready to confront. He reached out, his hand brushing hers with a touch that was both gentle and firm. "You deserve to feel alive," he said softly. His words cut through her like a knife, breaking open a dam of emotions she had been holding back for years. A sob escaped her lips before she could stop it, and she turned away, unable to meet his gaze. He had put into words the very truth she had been too afraid to face. For years, she had convinced herself that this monotonous, hollow routine was all there was to life. But now, in his presence, she couldn't ignore the possibility of more. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hand away, the guilt already gnawing at her. "This was a mistake." He nodded, the pain evident in his eyes, though he didn't argue. "I'll leave if that's what you want." She didn't respond. Her mind was a whirlwind of guilt, longing, and indecision. He stood, gathering his tools with deliberate slowness, as if hoping she would stop him. But she couldn't bring herself to say the words. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving her alone once more. She sank back into the sofa, her heart weighed down by the enormity of her actions. The memory of his touch lingered, a painful reminder of the line she had crossed. She knew there was no going back, no undoing what had happened. And yet, despite the overwhelming guilt, a small, selfish part of her couldn't deny the truth. She didn't regret it. A house cloaked in silence. The evening stretched on, the house enveloped in its usual stillness. She sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the muted television, but the quiet was unbearable now. Her thoughts refused to stay still, looping endlessly back to the moments they had shared. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, her mind replaying every glance, every word, every unspoken feeling that had passed between them. Her husband arrived home later than usual, his entrance as predictable as ever, a brief nod in her direction before disappearing into his study. The sound of his footsteps echoed louder tonight, each one a stark reminder of the life she had chosen and the vows she had broken. She wanted to speak, to bridge the ever-widening gap between them, but the words wouldn't come. She watched him retreat into the shadows of the hallway, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. She turned off the television, unable to bear the noise, and leaned back against the cushions. The weight of guilt pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. She had always prided herself on her loyalty, her ability to endure. But now, that pride felt like a cruel joke. She wasn't the woman she thought she was. She was someone who had given in, someone who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. A spark of defiance. Yet beneath the guilt, another feeling emerged, a spark of defiance. For the first time in years, she had felt alive. His touch, his words, his very presence had ignited something within her that she thought had long since died. She had spent so many years shrinking into the quiet corners of her marriage, folding herself into a version of life that felt small and suffocating. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And now, having tasted it, the loss felt unbearable. She stood, pacing the living room as her thoughts ricocheted between the past and the present. She thought of the early days of her marriage, when her husband had looked at her as if she were the center of his world. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath years of indifference and routine. She had clung to them, hoping they might return. But now, she wasn't sure they ever would. A choice to make. Her gaze fell on the phone on the side table. Her fingers hovered over it, torn between the urge to call him, the man who had reminded her of what it felt like to be alive, and the fear of what it might mean. What would she even say? That she couldn't stop thinking about him? That she didn't know how to live with herself after what they had done? Instead, she dialed another number, one she had avoided for months. Her mother's voice answered on the other end, warm and familiar. "Is everything okay?" her mother asked, her tone laced with concern. She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. I needed to hear your voice." Her mother didn't press for details. She simply listened, offering quiet reassurance. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to cry. The conversation was brief, but it left her feeling lighter, as though she had shared some of the weight she'd been carrying. Confronting the truth. When she hung up, she returned to the sofa, her thoughts clearer now. She knew she had a choice to make, one that would shape the rest of her life. She could continue pretending everything was fine, burying herself in the facade of a life she no longer recognized. Or she could confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Her husband's voice broke the silence. "You're still up?" She looked at him, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she considered telling him everything about the plumber, the kiss, the emptiness she had been drowning in. But the words caught in her throat. She didn't know if she had the courage to say them.